2,500 years ago, the first emperor of China died drinking an elixir his court alchemist promised would grant him immortality, a fate several more emperors would share in his wake. In another world, a chosen undead chooses to link the flame in hopes of staving off humanity's decay a little while longer. In 1535, a Spanish court chronicler writes of a mythic quest to find the Fountain of Youth. In 1947, Argentine author Jorge Luis Borges writes of a man seeking out the City of the Immortals, only to find it full of impossible architecture and populated by dull, childlike creatures he calls troglodytes. In 1990, almost 3 million people died not from tuberculosis but from a lack of medical care. In 2014, tech billionaire Peter Thiel declares his intention to be cryogenically frozen on his deathbed in hopes of being reanimated in a future where he might live forever. In 2019, my grandfather died after a long fight against his neurological condition. In 17776, humans immune to aging play football forever. In a far-flung future, an artist paints the sky with a colour from deep in his immortal past, and a society of digital humans delete themselves from existence. The quest for immortality is perhaps the oldest story humanity has, but does it mean forever evolving or forever decaying? Death has always been 2 steps behind, but we might just be about to outrun it. And it begs the question, should we? And is this really about our fear of death, or something deeper? Almost every From Software game is, in one way or another, fundamentally about decay, about attempting to forestall it and death and the cost of doing so. This is most literal in Sekiro, where you, the player, can live forever, but only by spreading the dragon rot to other people around you, which will, in time, kill them. A blight on the land itself, living not on borrowed, but stolen time. Or consider the decay of immortality in Dark Souls, where humanity's true form is as the Hollows, creatures lacking will and emotions, who also happen to be, of all things, immortal. The Age of Fire prevents humanity from lapsing back into this form, and the fundamental choice at the end of the game is whether to continue the Age of Fire. While Hollows have a kind of bodily, physical immortality, like you do in Sekiro, Hollows are also creatures of disconnection, isolation, echoed in the game's mechanics. The closer to Hollow you are, the less other players and characters can interact with your game. Hollows are unable to build the great empires like the one we see the ghosts of in the game world, shells of who they once were. Like in Sekiro, you can acquire immortality, but only at the cost of yourself, of those around you, of the civilization you have built. This theme continues in Elden Ring, where after the rune of death was removed, people began living unnaturally long lives. While Miyazaki describes the immortality of the demigods themselves as, quote, stemming from having their fated deaths removed from the Elden Ring, fate being something intentional, natural, designed. In both Sekiro and Elden Ring, immortality is presented as a circumvention of natural, even divine law, things not meant to be tampered with. While Dark Souls curiously presents immortality as humanity's natural state here, that is only because decay is the natural state of things, and we defy it by living on,
refusing our decay by holding on to our mortality.
Nothing lasts forever, FromSoft whispers. Not you, not I. An immortal thing is a hollow thing, a tarnished thing, like this place about me, a ruined thing. Death is a curiously humanizing force in these stories, and perhaps nobody demonstrates that better than Saith the Scaleless.
Saith the Scaleless is a boss from Dark Souls, a dragon whose desperate pursuit of immortality leads him to mutilate his body and fall down the path of madness. He obsesses over ancient knowledge, locks himself away in his tower, his quest leading him to experiment on others, forcing them to bear dragon children, all in hopes he might discover sails which can confer on him immortality. He even, eventually, creates a new kind of tortured life. Here, it is not immortality itself which corrupts you and the world about you, but your pursuit of it, because these stories are so often about obsession.
obsession which controls you, changes you, the deeply human addiction to something you can taste but will never have. This is envy, drawn out. Despite his love of knowledge and learning, Seyth's library is ruined by this vast crystalline infection which has taken over everything in his pursuit.
If Seyth's story reminds you of anything, it's because this is Dark Souls' Frankenstein, a man whose obsession which destroys him was also originally about, you guessed it, immortality.
Wealth was an inferior object, but what glory would attend the discovery if I could banish disease from the human frame and render man invulnerable to any but a violent death?
The fear of and obsession with staving off decay can ultimately destroy anything worth preserving, especially when it cloaks itself in glory and good, eclipsing any moral boundaries you once had. These stories force us to ask ourselves, if it really came down to it, what would you do to preserve your life? What would you sacrifice? What decay would you succumb to? It's one of those questions we cannot know the answer to till we ever have to try, but history is full of people trying. The first emperor of China, Qin Shi Huang, was famously terrified of death, obsessed with trying to find a way to avoid it. His fear made him gullible, unwise, susceptible to snake oil salesmen trying to sell him false elixirs of life. In one account, a man called Su Fu promised he could bring back a herb from an island of the immortals, if only the emperor gave him a ton of money and 500 virgin boys and girls. They never returned. But like Seyth, his obsession also made him cruel. In his later years, he ordered 460 of his court alchemists buried alive, supposedly for not making enough progress on his immortality, until, legend goes, his desire ultimately killed him, a poisoned elixir. In the age of alchemy, alchemists spent fortunes and lifetimes consumed in their quest trying to create the Philosopher's Stone. Once, like Paracelsus even claimed to have done it, alchemists were obsessed with the idea that substances like mercury, of all things, were magical. They were both solids and liquids, and in those special properties, they end up drinking it, using it, sentencing themselves and others to an early death. Not unlike the nobles of Sekiro or the demigods of Elden Ring or Seyth of Dark Souls, it is not immortality which leads to moral and personal decay, but our obsession with it.
I know I can be prone to obsession. If something really takes me, I can lock myself away for days. I won't eat, I won't drink, I'll barely sleep, I will neglect myself and others my relationships, caught up in the ambition and hyperfixation like Seyth and Frankenstein and Qin Shi Huang. How many times has obsession consumed you? The curse of obsession is that it can eclipse everything we are, until, eventually, it becomes who we are. And what greater obsession does humanity have than not dying? As venture capitalist and immortality quester Brian Johnson puts it,
the only objective we have is don't die.
But if one day our obsession leads to an elixir of life, it begs the question, who should get to drink it?
In Greg Egan's Permutation City, people can copy their minds over and over into a digital world, becoming extensions of you throughout this digital framework. They offer digital immortality. But many of the copies in Permutation City are not just your average person who wants to live forever. They are billionaires dying from terminal illnesses who go on to live their next best life in VR. These worlds are not only sustained by trust funds, huge fortunes they built up throughout their lives, but they suck up much of the world's computing power as a real resource, just to keep them alive. On the other hand, poor copies live in virtual slums, slow clubs, forced to run at slower speeds and tossed around to whoever can afford to keep them, even frozen or put on hold until living itself is affordable again. An immortal thing is an expensive thing, and currency is life. In Egan's world, not only the quality of life you live, but the length of it can be bought. We see a similar theme in Richard Morgan's Altered Carbon, where humanity has figured out how to live forever. By storing your mind in what they call a stack at the base of your neck, you can upload your mind to a new body over and over, like a USB. Only the technology isn't available to everyone, because of course it isn't. Only the uber-wealthy Methuselahs can afford it. Like the poor copies live in the virtual slow clubs, the Methuselahs live forever in their nigh heavenly estates, while the poor live and, more importantly, die in squalor. These stories too are about decay. Egan and Morgan ask us to look at radical life extension not as a magical hypothetical or philosophical question, but as a practical reality.
Because if immortality is to exist, it will not be some rejuvenating natural magical water like in Sekiro, nor a magical rune like in Elden Ring. It will be a tangible, invented, real technology to be bought and sold, something people have stakes in, shares in, with quarterly projections and profit margins, something people can own, control, the world's most valuable subscription service, a resource and commodity and luxury.
You live that long, things start happening to you. You get too impressed with yourself. Ends up you think you're God. Suddenly the little people, 30, maybe 40 years old, well, they don't really matter anymore. You've seen whole societies rise and fall, and you start to feel you're standing outside it all, and none of it really matters to you. And maybe you'll start snuffing those little people, just like picking daisies, if they get under your feet. They deal with humanity the way you and I deal with insect life.
Where Sekiro's decay comes from the existential role death plays in us, or saith, or Frankenstein's moral decay is deeply rooted in their obsession, Permutation City and Altered Carbon invite us to look at immortality's decay as something sociological, anthropological, another way for society itself to decay as wealth and power are further concentrated in the hands of the few, entrenching the systems which already exist. Stagnation. If this sounds hypothetical, well, in 2016, the Salk Institute for Biological Studies managed to extend the life of a mouse by 30% and reversed the signs of aging in human and mice cells in vitro. Mice share 85% of our genetics. They did this in part by activating genes which have the capacity to convert adult cells back to an embryonic-like state. Slowly, more and more, we are identifying the real, tangible causes of aging and death and circumventing them. The most valuable pharmaceutical drug ever made and the most inelastic good an economist could ever imagine, a monopoly to die for. But much of this research is funded by billionaires like Henry Beaufort, owner of the French pharmaceutical company Ipsen, or Yuri Milner, Robert Nelson, Peter Thiel, who has poured millions into, of all names, the Methuselah Foundation. And they don't just do it out of the good of their hearts. Famously, tech billionaire Brian Johnson can sell you his magical pill set, one I'm sure Emperor Xi Jinping would have paid through the nose for just $420 a year. Or get 5% off with your subscription fee. In 2014, Peter Thiel announced he would, amongst other billionaires, be cryogenically frozen on his deathbed for a measly $200,000, or just $80,000 if you're only interested in the head. None of this says it'll work, but I think Kelsea Yu said it best in her short story, The Orchard of Tomorrow.
It's a guarantee that they'll stay eternal, stay in power, a gift for those who already have everything.
Unless we stop it.
Inhumanity starts with intense inequality here. Like the hollows of Dark Souls, the immortality of the Methuselahs is a life of disconnection, a lack of perspective.
In the case of Permutation City, they literally inhabit a different world.
People like this become literally, physically, metaphorically, and morally disconnected from the rest of humanity.
Especially because if immortality is something which can be bought and sold, then living longer becomes a choice. And if it's a choice, then it's your fault for not living longer, for not working hard enough. You deserve what you've got. It's easy to get caught up in this concept of deserving. Like, it's an easy rationale for why the world does not need to change. But it always obscures more complex realities.
Tuberculosis has been around in one form or another for 150 million years. It kills by attacking the lungs. It starts with chest pain, then a vicious cough, night sweats. Then, over the years, it slowly destroys your organs so systematically that we still find the scars of it on bodies from thousands of years ago. Tuberculosis killed 1.3 million people in 2022 alone, more than COVID, more than malaria, more than HIV. Charles Dickens once described it as a disease which medicine never cured, wealth never warded off, or poverty could boast exemption from, but slow or quick is ever sure and certain. Only that isn't true. Revolutionary technologies have allowed us to diagnose and treat TB effectively for years now, and this revolutionary technology is even available across the world for anyone who can afford it. 80% of TB deaths occur now in low or middle income countries, while only 2% occur in North America or Europe. To the wealthiest countries in the world, tuberculosis is virtually no more real than smallpox is, a disease humanity eradicated some decades ago. There's something ironic in us pouring billions into finding this magical, uncertain, holy technological grail elixir of life, when radical life extension for millions is already real. We just refuse to pay for it. One study estimates that even survivors of TB lose a decade of life with their increased mortality, not to mention the 1.3 million who never see the collective millions of years of life between them, something immortality research could only hope to imitate.
Sci-fi is so often a cautionary tale, something that's meant to happen in the future if things aren't going well, but we already live in a world where wealth separates you from a longer life. We already live in the autoverse of Permutation City. The corporation Danaher, responsible for much of the revolutionary technology able to diagnose and treat TB, records massive profits year on year, but only because they drive the price up with a 300% markup. Inhumanity starts with inequality again.
While Danaher did lower the price of one TB test by 20% in response to recent pressure, they did not lower it for the more vital kind of tests for the more deadly strains of TB, nor many of the other necessary technologies that could save lives.
Decay here is not something that happens to us outside of our control. Decay is something we allow to happen.
It's decay in the fabric of society itself.
Like many new technologies, radical life extension has the capacity to make the cracks already in society bigger, cracks where the decay can seep through, if we let it. But if that's the case, is immortality really a bad thing? Is it really one of those we kept asking whether we could rather than whether we should things, or are we just trying to make living with death easier? Is death really a fundamental part of being human, and is moving beyond the human a bad thing? And to answer that, I need to tell you about Jorge Luis Borges' Impossible City.
In his story, The Immortal, Borges writes of a man seeking out the legendary City of the Immortals, only to find it full of grotesque nonsense architecture, upside-down staircases leading to deadly shafts, designs which make no geometric sense just looking at them. A city, he writes, so horrific that its mere existence pollutes the past and the future. More than that, he finds it populated by these troglodytes who appear mindless, immature, slow, only to learn they are, in fact, the final form of the immortals he has been seeking.
There is no more complex pleasure than thought, and it was to thought that we delivered ourselves over. Taught by centuries of living, the Republic of Immortal Men had achieved a perfection of tolerance, almost of disdain. They knew that over an infinitely long span of time, all things happen to all men. I know of men who have done evil in order that good may come of it in future centuries, or may have already come of it in centuries past. Viewed in that way, all our acts are just, though also unimportant. There are no spiritual or intellectual merits. No one is someone. A single immortal man is all men. Like Cornelius Agrippa, I am God, hero, philosopher, demon and world, which is a long-winded way of saying that I'm not.
There is a lot to unpack here, but do you remember that old thought experiment about how a monkey with a typewriter, given infinite time, would eventually create the entire works of Shakespeare, word for word, line for line, beat for beat, in chronological order? Well, if that's the case, then is writing Shakespeare's to be or not to be all that impressive? Someone's gonna do it eventually. When Borges writes of how in eternity all things happen to all men, he's not only saying how eventually everyone would write a Shakespearean masterpiece, even if by chance, but eventually we would all become morally equivalent, having done enough good things and bad things to just look on the world and each other with disdain. Everyone, as he says, a god, a hero, a philosopher, demon, and world. Or, in other words, we would decay to become nobody at all. Aim not. After all, is that not the fate of these ponderous troglodytes? They have decayed into nobodies. Are they not unlike the hollows of Dark Souls? For Borges, the decay of immortality is not just immorality, but apathy, regression to the mean, to sameness.
Like the Ashina nobles, or saith the Scalers, or the Methuselahs, or the wretch copies, everything unique in us will decay to a shell of what we once were. It's not just death that gives us perspective or the ability to create great things, but only in our finitude can we define ourselves and our moral and social value.
When time is scarce, our choices become valuable.
But then you ask, what of the impossible city they built? For Borges, infinity would see us lose any wonder, joy, interest we have in the world, hence why the troglodytes have retreated into thought, the last complex experience they have. He mentions how occasionally, extremely unusual physical experiences like the smell of rain at dawn might cut through the monotony, but the city, was a last-ditch effort to maintain interest in the world, constructing a place so bizarre, so complex, so unearthly, so unnatural, they might find something stimulating just in trying to navigate it. But it doesn't work. This story, like all the rest, is ultimately about decay, just of a different kind. Decay of identity, of meaning. Immortality just guarantees that. The age of fire ends. An immortal thing is a meaningless thing. In 1926, Czech composer Karel Capek wrote an opera called The Markupulos Case. It recounts the story of a woman, Elena, who is granted immortality in 300-year increments, able to renew it each time she chooses by drinking an alchemical elixir. If this sounds familiar, it's because Neil Gaiman shares an almost identical setup to the character of Hobgadling, a man granted immortality in 100-year increments, like Elena having to decide whether to continue on each time. In both of these stories, unlike Borges, the choice to live on is more important, a choice we all have to make. How long do we live with that decay? There's an escape hatch built in. Only these two stories diverge in one important way. Hob chooses to extend his life several times over, proclaiming death is a mug's game, whereas Elena, reaching the end of just her first 300-year life, chooses to accept death, claiming only mortality gives us a sense of transcendence and purpose.
Oh, life should not last so long. For you, everything makes sense. For you, everything has its value, for the trivial chance reason that you are going to die so soon. But in me, life has come to a halt. What a hideous solitude. And one comes to learn that the soul has died inside one.
This is not unlike Hobgadling's final moments in the Sandman comic, where, having lived through the centuries, he finds himself disconnected from the world he now inhabits.
I used to think death was a big, sudden thing, like a huge owl that would swoop down out of the night and carry you off. I think it's a slow thing, like a thief who comes into your house day after day, taking a little thing here and a little thing there. And one day, you walk around your house and there's nothing to keep you, nothing to make you want to stay. And then you lie down and shut up forever. Lots of little deaths until the last big one.
Even though these are both more grounded depictions, it is hard not to see Borges' immortal here. Hob has been a slaver, a slave, a noble, a poor man, a widower, a murderer. He has been everything, achieved everything, been all men, and now feels little for the world. In the end, he returns to this old Renaissance tavern, curiously like the one he started in, seeking out perhaps some feeling like the troglodytes did in their impossible labyrinth. His line about suffering a lot of little deaths reflects Borges' own, that immortality only multiplies a man's deaths. And what is decay if not the slow death of 1,000 things? Like the troglodytes, Elena and Hob retreat into themselves, into the past, into nostalgia. For a large part of my life, Doctor Who was everything. It's honestly difficult for me to communicate, to put into words just how transformative that story and that series was for me and who I am and how I look on the world. I've tried to put it into words so many times, but I can't. I have gone back and held onto the series for so long. I have followed it and enjoyed it, but so much of that is trying to recapture the magic of that part of my life, of what that story meant to me, and yet knowing that I can never go back to that. I can never have that again. And I don't know if I ever will. I hope that I will, or I hope that I'll find it somewhere else, but I don't know if I ever will. How often as an adult have you tried to recapture some specific joy you had as a child? Some wonder you seem to have lost, or maybe something inside you decayed that prevents you from enjoying it the same way you used to anymore. Maybe it's so wrapped up in how new it was at the time, how we were at the time, and so we go searching, we look for bigger, better, more extreme experiences, hoping to mimic, hoping to recapture that magic, and yet, at some point, it never gets as good as it was the time before. As it was reading that book, playing that game, and crying yourself to sleep at 2 a.m. As playing Dungeons & Dragons with that group of people, as loving that person. And so we beat back, boats against the current, borne ceaselessly back into the past. There's a reason that even as we grow old, we listen to the music from our youth, that as time moves on, a part of us remains in the past, till eventually all of us is. And with that, we get stretched too thin, like butter scraped over too much bread. Capek suggests this can happen in as little as 3 centuries. Gaiman maybe 1,000 or so, Borges even more, but they all promise it will happen. That life is sand slipping through our fingers we desperately try to mold into the shape of something we can believe in, but eventually we can't see anything in it at all. We think we're telling stories about an endless future, but we're really telling stories about the realization that as we grow, a part of us remains in the one place we can never return to, the past. And how long can you bear the weight of that? An immortal thing is a nostalgic thing. And so, some of them argue, we should not seek out immortality at all. But, how much of this is really true? How much of this is, cope? The idea of death as a natural, moral, even important part of human existence goes back a long way. Socrates even suggested once that death might be the greatest blessing that can ever happen to man, so don't tamper with it too much. FromSoft suggests there is something indefinably existentially human about coexisting with death. But humanity has a long history of trying to moralize terrifying realities we cannot control and have to live with. Natural disasters, pain in childbirth, disease. It's easier to deal with if it feels morally deserved or part of some justice in the grand scheme of things. Would immortality really deprive us of meaning and identity? Or is this just us going gently into that good night when everything demands that we should rage? When you take a step back and think about it, it sounds almost paradoxical to say death somehow makes life more meaningful than living more could. In fact, existentialist philosopher Jon Bois Sartre even goes as far to say that death is the killer of any meaning we have.
Death is never that which gives life its meanings. It is, on the contrary, that which on principle removes all meaning from life. If we must die, then our life has no meaning, because its problems receive no solution, and because the very meaning of the problems remains undetermined. Death confers a meaning from the outside on everything which I live in subjectivity. Death reapprehends all this subjective, which while it lived, defended itself against exteriorization, and death deprives it of all subjective meaning in order to hand it over to any objective meaning which the other is pleased to give it. The final value of my conduct remains forever in suspense.
Any meaning we find for ourselves necessarily deteriorates after we die. It is left in ruins. We cannot control what other people say or do about us, what they read into our lives, and more importantly, putting a deadline on human life prevents us from seeking out certain kinds of meaning. For example, if a mayfly was born as conscious and intelligent as a human, they could not craft a Shakespearean masterpiece, but not for a lack of skill, but a lack of time. If death keeps us from some mysterious decay we've never seen, then it also keeps us from new meanings we've never been able to pursue, from rising to new heights we haven't yet been able to conceive of.
There's a video called Long Art by Solar Sands, talking through art pieces designed to play out over years, even millennia, far beyond their lives and possibly beyond humanity itself if left untouched. But these are rare projects, hard to justify in an ever-temporary world, but it begs the question, free of death, what would you pursue? If our sense of value comes from death, then it necessarily skews what we must count as meaningful. What projects might we pursue? What identity might we find if we had 2 centuries, let alone a millennia? You might hike every mountain in the world, master every cuisine, but one of the obvious answers is, of course, climate change. One of the issues with solving climate change is that humans are incredibly good at dealing with problems and divining meaning from things which directly affect them, but not so great otherwise. If your house is on fire, you know what to do, but if your house will be on fire in 200 years from now when you're dead and gone and it belongs to someone else, unless you fix the insulation now, well, that's probably their problem, isn't it? Longer life would give us a longer view of meaning, unlock new joys and identities and values that we have no concept of yet. It could even permit us lives of greater moral purpose. More than that, plenty of meaning is independent of any deadly deadline. The race to the moon wasn't against death, but another nation, for prestige, for pride. Whether you will be the next Shakespeare isn't really a matter of time so much as whether you get there before others do. At the end of The Sandman, Hob Gadling is given one more chance to end his life, seemingly deep in his own misery. But unlike Elena, he chooses not to.
saying his girlfriend Gwen would kill him, suggesting that even in eternity, we can still divine meaning from the constantly evolving risk and deadline of human relationships.
That there may never come a time we would prefer to die, even in our misery, because of the meaning we can find in each other.
And our choices inevitably have risk built into them. If 10,000 years from now I choose to scale a mountain instead of help this person, I will forever be the person who chose not to help that person.
But all of this is deceptive. The argument is about how we live with ourselves when meaning slowly slips away from us, when decay is inevitable. But that's already a problem we face in our mortal lives. We already have to repeatedly find and craft new meaning and purpose for ourselves as we age, purpose which inevitably decays well before death is ever on the radar. Immortality might compound these issues, but it is by no means unique to it, and so writers and philosophers have been arguing about solutions since ever. And so, to find our answers, I need to ask you to come with me to 17,000 years in the future.
In Jon Bois's 17776, or What Football Will Look Like in the Future, one day, humans stop dying. They just go on living forever. And so what do? They play football. Massive games with hundreds of players each side, with football fields multiple states wide, with games played over hundreds of years, with bizarre rules that spiral into absurdity. The sort of people who would enjoy playing football inside Borges' immortal labyrinthine city of nonsense architecture. And one of these thousands of games takes place on a thin bit of land stretching from Washington to New Mexico. Only owing to some planning error, the ball gets stuck in a canyon. Sheer cliffs either side which neither team can ever scale without getting pulled down. You can't move the ball forward, can't move it back, and so the 22 players fight on. Not for days, not for decades, but 13,000 years down in that canyon. If this sounds like a terrible game of football, it's because, well, it probably is. I actually don't know, I've never watched a game of football. But you start to wonder, are these people happy? Are they broken in some way? Are they even human? Humans aren't meant to be like that, right? And Bois goes on to say,
a human being will rarely admit this, but they tend to be terrified of living forever. Now boredom is their only enemy, and if you find yourself in a football game that's such a gargantuan task that seems undefeatable, that will claim eons of your time and your passion, I think that makes you one of the lucky ones.
Existentialists like Jean-Paul Sartre, though he protested the term, offered one solution. They argued that faced with the realization that everything we do ultimately doesn't matter, we have to construct our own meaning and find joy in that. But that's not easy, that's not simple. How are you meant to do that? Throwing ourselves down to be more and more involved in the world, and importantly in each other, we can find more meaning. To Sartre, death is the killer of meaning. It always looms and prevents us from seeing greater meaning we might otherwise pursue. The humans down in that canyon are ultimately engaging and constructing their own meaning. Football gives you a constructed deadline, a constructed set of rules through which you can define success and failure and meaning and identity and relationship, even though they know on some level that game will never truly be won. That eventually people will forget this game is happening at all, and they do. That decay always wins, and they're in an uphill battle against it.
But I can't stop thinking about that one line, a gargantuan, undefeatable task. Do you know the legend of Sisyphus? He was a Corinthian king condemned to push a boulder up a hill in Tartarus forever. The parallels to the 22 players trapped in the canyon trying to push a football up an unscalable cliff for 13,000 years are uncanny. It is a Sisyphean task.
The Myth of Sisyphus is also a book by absurdist philosopher Albert Camus, who tackles this same question. What do we do about craving a sense of purpose and the realization the universe has none to offer? Camus calls for us to, what he calls, live in revolt. Discard all hope that you can ever truly find meaning and lose yourself in the struggle against this absurd reality by living as best you can. Where existentialism suggests we can be at peace with our reality by finding our own meaning,
Camus doesn't think we can ever truly be at peace with our purposeless existence, a reality that an immortal person might grapple with even more, and so life has to be a constant rebellion, resisting the horror by living as happily and as long as we can, while pushing our boulder pointlessly up that hill. For Camus, death is the end of that revolt he implores us to fight.
And perhaps those 22 players at the bottom of that canyon are doing just that. They're laughing in the face of the absurd, never settled, never at peace, but pushing that ball up that hill regardless and living better for it. Your mileage may vary with absurdism as an answer to this problem, but it is one we already face in our mortal lives, so why not a longer one? Viva la revolution. An immortal thing can be a meaningful thing.
And yet, perhaps, one day, the day will come when none of these approaches are sustainable for us any longer. We would have done all we ever wished or imagined we could. We cannot sustain our rebellion another day. And at this point, some stories suggest that death is okay.
Greg Egan put it well in describing a whole society called the Transmuters in his book Diaspora, one of the weirdest books I've ever met, who, having done everything they wanted in the world, decided to simply delete themselves from existence.
It won't be death. The Transmuters didn't die, they played out every possibility within themselves. That's not death, it's completion.
If the tragedy of death is leaving life incomplete, then the tragedy ends here. And yet,
there's one line that people often pass over in the myth of Sisyphus, which has always stuck with me.
If this myth is tragic, that is because its hero is conscious. The workman of today works every day in his life at the same tasks, and this fate is no less absurd. But it is only tragic at the rare moments when he becomes conscious.
Camus does not mean literally conscious here. He means for us to be aware of our meaningless fate.
And Borges alludes to the very same idea in The Immortal, that what is divine and terrible and incomprehensible is to know oneself immortal. To know what you're doing will ultimately never mean anything.
The Transmuters were only conscious of their fate so long as they needed to be. But other stories offer that no, there is another way to go on, that death is not the only option.
In Alistair Reynolds' Zima Blue, which I recently learned was a Love, Death and Robots episode, an immortal artist becomes obsessed with a colour he only faintly remembers. His art becomes saturated with it as he tries to divine exactly where he knows it from, why it's so special to him. His art grows larger and larger till the pieces can't even be hosted on planets anymore. Zima uses these 10,000 kilometer across canvases in space, with whole stellar economies competing to host his work. Zima achieves everything an artist could ever hope for: money, fame, influence, revolutionizing the industry, and he finally finds where that color comes from. The color of the tiles in a pool he used to clean when he was a child. See, Zima was once a robot vacuum cleaner, of all things. Over the years, he was built out, made more advanced, and evolved until he acquired sentience and intelligence, a cyborg from the other direction. But it's the end of Reynolds' story which matters most to us. Having achieved everything he could ever dream of in his immortal life, Zima decides he is finished with consciousness. He decides to revert back to his childlike form as a vacuum cleaner and clean the pool with those blue tiles forever. If the tragedy of Sisyphus is being so conscious of our boulder, as Zima was, then the tragedy ends here. If, as Borges says, it is only divine and terrible to know oneself immortal, then he has achieved a kind of enlightenment.
But something would remain. A little kernel of being, enough of a mind to recognize its own existence, enough of a mind to appreciate its surroundings and to extract some trickle of pleasure and contentment from the execution of a task, no matter how purposeless. The near mindless euphoria of a pollinating insect. That was enough for him.
Zima here has accomplished what the Transmuters have. He has played out every variation of himself he can. He's 100% of the game, gotten all the trophies. But he takes a different path. Zima chooses to become something else, to transcend the human, and in that, find a new happy existence.
Literally change into a new kind of life with a new consciousness, a new way to continue the revolt, to construct new meaning when stamina runs out, even if this is only putting off the eventual end.
A lot of these stories focus on how a longer life makes us inhuman, but sometimes the better question to ask is, what's wrong with moving beyond the human? Zima sought out a lower level of consciousness, but many of these stories focus on technological augmentations that give them a different kind of existence, perhaps one even higher than what humanity has. But maybe these don't make us worse. Maybe they just make us something new, a new way for us to find meaning and identity. And this might sound strange and alien and frightening, but the truth is, we are always becoming something new as we grow and age. The joys we had as children are not the same joys we have as adults. The fears and desires and modes of existence we had at one time in our life are not the same as the next. The meaning I have now is not the meaning I will have in my old age. It won't even be the same body, and so we ask, what might we become? What new existence might we seek out?
What new conscious reality might we continue our revolt in? Maybe we ascend to a higher level of existence, of cognition, of awareness, and in that, new joys, new identity, new rebellion.
All of these stories, in one way or another, are about decay, about the inevitable decay of everything you have known and loved, about which decays we allow to happen and which we have no choice in, whether we live 100 years or 1,000. But I don't know if I'm convinced death is necessary to being human, as if our imaginations are so limited. I don't even know if I'm convinced death is what we're truly afraid of, as if that's the thing we're trying to run from. Death is just a final symptom of a very specific kind of decay we all have to grapple with. A decay these stories speak to more real than the Hollows, more devastating than saith the Scaleless, more universal than Zima Blue, and more certain than the Troglodytes.
When you start the game, the world of Before I Forget is largely colorless. It lacks texture and definition, like a half-rendered asset. That is, until you move around and interact with things. Whatever you pick up slowly gains that color and texture, as if the world itself becomes more real again by you interacting with it. The things you don't make the effort to interact with remain alien. There are notes from someone all over the house about the gas bill, the fridge, about the absurd number of canned peaches you have in the cupboards for some reason. There's this ever-present sense of you fading in and out of the world, only able to grasp at some small part of the full reality at any given time. Time passes randomly in the game, suddenly flicking to day or night in an instant. Your name, as you figure out, is Sunita, but about halfway through the game, you suddenly need to go to the bathroom. A minor task, the sort of thing any other game would put in their tutorial to teach you WASD controls, but as you move through the house, it changes around you. Doors open but go to rooms they never did before, hallways stretch and curve. Any orientation you've built up playing the game so far is gone. A game which is entirely based around feeling your way through the environment takes that away until, well, the worst happens. It feels uncomfortable. It feels humiliating. Your body lets you down. But there's an even sadder kind of decay in Before I Forget. As you wander through this house, you find scraps of your life, including a copy of the Modern Scientist magazine with your face on the front cover, but you don't recognize why. You come across a trophy for Scientific Discovery of the Year awarded to you, of all people, but you don't even remember it.
Wow, that sounds impressive. But I don't think it was me.
Some of the most important parts of you are leaking out the cracks in your mind, caught up in a decay you can't control. The horror of Before I Forget is unique. A decay more real than Dark Souls or The Immortal or Permutation City. It's the inevitable and unstoppable decline of our bodies and minds as we age. One which doesn't just take our future from us, the simplest capacity to go to the bathroom, but it takes our past too. Like Dr. Sunita Appleby, people forget who they are. They forget their families, they forget themselves. The things which make you who you are, achievements, loves, failings, they all fall through the cracks of our mind.
We do not become less of a person if we suffer from these conditions, but we can feel parts of us we had before slipping away.
Humans have been living longer and longer, but we can't always take our minds with us into those latter years. Sunita's rage and anger at herself, at the pain of forgetting, is palpable. The unfairness of it, the rules changing around her. You recognize the condition soon enough, but Sunita doesn't recognize it in herself, perhaps doesn't even want to. Throughout the game, you also hear piano music. Your partner, Dylan, is said to be a classical pianist, but as the game goes on, the music starts to decay. It fills with static, the notes are a little off. It's hard not to see this as a reference to Leyland Kirby's Everywhere at the End of Time, a 6.5-hour composition and one of the most interesting and uncomfortable pieces of art I have ever encountered. The music is deceptive. It starts out coherent, composed, before a decay starts to creep in.
The odd note might be off, the distortion is so brief and subtle you can convince yourself it didn't happen. But then musical cues repeat and the static creeps in till it's so loud that you realize it's there, and suddenly you can feel where everything's going wrong. Progressively, the music decays, slowly at first and then very quickly, losing definition and composition, drones pitching in until there is no definition. It is an empty, echoing shell, and all that's left are the hell sirens. No musical note can take shape in here, no melody or identity. There are brief moments of lucidity cutting through, vague hints of the past, distant memories of a music you heard all the way at the start 6 hours ago, as memories often linger in the minds of those afflicted with degenerative conditions. The newest memories, like Sunita's awards, often go first. The final section of Leyland's piece is called "The Long Decline is Over," another word for decay.
It is difficult, to say the least, to find stories of immortality which are not, in one way or another, about maintaining some lost, desired youth. In the earliest mythic stories of the Fountain of Youth, the quest is more about finding waters which might turn an old man young than the idea of living forever. The Philosopher's Stone confers not only life on those who create it, but bodily youth. Even in Sekiro, in your final battle with Genichiro, while the country is burning down around you, Genichiro summons the leader of Ashina not just in his prime, but his youth, symbolically trying to revive the past and stall the inevitable decay at the cost of his own life and body. Youth becomes the way to victory, to vitality, to something worth preserving. These stories don't just channel our fears of a nebulous eternity, but of the loss of our bodily and psychological integrity. Immortality isn't just about preserving, it's about preserving a very specific version of us. The version we see as our best, as the most real, authentic, capable, upon which our vision of ourselves depends. When these stories talk about immortality depriving us of our ability to find meaning, it's hard to see how that isn't caught up in our ideas of youth and being able-bodied and minded, something that bodily or neurological conditions, often coming in old age, can interfere with. This isn't even true necessarily, but it is a fear a lot of people have. The fear of getting old isn't just about the loss of bodily autonomy, but loss of our position in society from which we often derive a lot of meaning. The horror that one day we won't be able to write or talk or make art or keep up or do things for ourselves, that our own bodies will become prisons, our own minds sinking sand. When we're drawn to nostalgia, it's not just to the past, but to a day we felt we were more beautiful, our minds were sharper, our knees didn't hurt, when we were at the center of society. After all, retirement is often coupled with the loss of a job or children moving out. When so much of the world exists in the online, ever-evolving technological arena, our bodies and minds getting slower and losing the ability to keep up with the ever-evolving technologies of the world means being disconnected from much of the present society. The feeling of being a burden, of loneliness, is a legitimate, widespread issue. Our meaning and identity are caught up even more so in youth, more than they are in death. When we imagine ourselves as largely as needing to write that book, make that movie, climb that mountain, get that job before a certain age, an era of our lives, not before we die, and especially before we lose the bodily or mental ability to do these things at all, as Sunita loses her greatest achievements in the labyrinth of her mind, afflicted by her condition, as her body fails her, as she reaches everywhere at the end of time and the end of the Age of Fire.
Oscar Wilde's The Picture of Dorian Gray isn't just about a man selling his soul to live forever, but one desperately trying to preserve himself against the inevitable march of it.
How sad it is. I shall grow old and horrible and dreadful, jealous of everything whose beauty does not die, jealous of the portrait you have painted of me. Why should it keep what I must lose? Every moment that passes takes something from me and gives something to it.
It is no wonder the anti-aging movement has taken off in the age of social media, where identity and value have become so wrapped up in one's appearance. Almost all of the stories we've talked about in this video speak to immortals finding purpose primarily in pursuits easiest when you have an able body and mind, raising children, games of physical prowess, competition, art with perfectly controlled finesse, memory, and building. And more importantly, these stories are about the horror of losing those things.
The horror here is not living without these things, but losing them after finding so much of ourselves in them and knowing they are slipping away from us, from our bodies and minds for years
and not being able to stop it. For most of my life, my grandfather was one of the most physically active, hands-on, do-it-yourself, present in the world, see everything, do everything people you could imagine. He was out sailing and fishing and building and landscaping, and he had this gorgeous house up on this hill. Right into his old age, he was funny, smart, really with it, intellectual sparring partner, until one day, several years ago now, he was diagnosed with progressive supranuclear palsy, or PSP, an extremely rare and aggressive neurological disorder caused by a buildup of these unusual proteins in the brain. It started out in small things. He lost his balance while walking. He got tremors in his hands, or his muscles stiffened up so he couldn't pick up a knife or fork. But I think the thing I remember the most was his anger. I watched him lose his ability to walk, but before that, his ability to work with his hands at all. And he hated that. God, he hated it. It made him so angry that this was his fate. He couldn't garden or fillet a fish or help with his hands in the way he used to, and he could feel the whole time that slipping away from him. Eventually, he lost his ability to speak, and he couldn't look you in the eye. He felt his body and mind were turning against him, and so suddenly, all of this happened in just a couple of years. And he was angry. I remember that so vividly. Angry that so much of what had given him meaning in life was just being ripped from him, day by day, week by week. Death was an afterthought compared to the decay. Eventually, my grandparents had to move out of their home up on that hill, a home I knew he loved. It was full of all this sailing memorabilia. He was a sailor in his youth. But the stairs and the heights were too dangerous for him. His own body could literally not exist in the place he called home, even if his mind wanted to. He never made it to their new home. He was too ill. He lived with us in those final days. He lay on this bed, mouth agape, death just one gasp away. And as bad as it sounds, I really struggled to see him like that. I struggled to go to him and talk to him as he faced all of this, knowing how much he hated the fate life had left him to, that he didn't feel like it was him lying on that bed anymore. And I really didn't know how to face up to that. When I finally went to him, I remember thanking him, not only for being the best grandfather I could ever ask for, but because there's a decent chance that I wouldn't be doing this at all if it wasn't for him. He was the one who gave me my first tripod. One day he came to me and he said, "Hey, use this, and then when you're done with it, sell it on Trade Me." That's New Zealand eBay. And I did, I took it. And what did I do? I went out and I bought a $150 camera and I started making videos. And I never looked back. But I also know why I struggled so much in his final days. The truth is, I am terrified of death. The idea that I could just cease to exist one day and there is nothing I can do about that terrifies the hell out of me. I am 28 now, so statistically I'm about a third of my way through my life. But I also know that when you ask people what the middle of their life is, they tend to say somewhere around the age of 30. So in that way, I'm already halfway dead. But even more so, I'm afraid of the decay that might come with that. I'm terrified of losing myself before death. I'm painfully aware I have a countdown with these hands with which to write the stories I want to write, or these legs with which to hike the mountains I want to hike. Limited time before my brain slows down and the world keeps moving faster. When I think about immortality, I'm thinking about preserving some semblance of who I am in body and mind. I regret not spending more time with my granddad. I am ashamed that I struggled to go to him when he was suffering because I was uncomfortable with watching someone suffer a fate that I might one day too. It's a human response, but still. I know that if I was given a chance at eternal youth, I would take it. And I'd love to say it's because all the skeptics are wrong and actually immortality will be completely fine. But if I'm honest, it's because my fear of losing myself is probably stronger than my will to examine all of that particularly rationally. So much of my identity is wrapped up in my life as a creative, as a writer, and those are inherently caught up in the parts of my body. They're physical, tangible things I need to protect, my hands and my brain. Those are the parts of me that I would want to preserve as long as possible. No wonder my granddad was so angry when he lost the use of his hands. Or think about their minds as a scientist, like Sunita does, the finesse of their finger as an engineer or artist. Those who suffer through conditions like this can become new versions of themselves, just as worthy of protection and respect. But it's hard not to see the sadness in what was lost in that transition. Unlike Zima Blue, we do not get to decide who and what we become. That choice is taken from us. I don't know what lurks in my genes, and I don't know that I would want to know. My fate might already be written there, but I don't think that makes it designed. I don't think that makes it fair or deserved, that I should just surrender to it. Death is already written into all of our genes. At some point, even we in our cells decay, and our ability to renew ourselves runs out. But that doesn't make it right or deserved, does it? We lament death, but we lament the persistent temporariness of youth even more in that. The further we grow from it, the greater reminder of its value we get, and in that, immortality becomes more about reaching into the past than it does into the future. Of course, even faced with the inevitable decay of everything we know, we do try to immortalize some modicum of the meaning we have found through legacy. What we pass on, the seeds we plant for later generations, the art we leave behind. It's weird to think that these 400 or so videos so far of me in my 20s are gonna probably outlast me in some shape or form deep in the bowels of the internet. But they are not me, not in totality, and eventually they will vanish too. My name will disappear. Right now, I am standing in the ruins of a village in rural France from the 1790s. Right here, there was a mill where people used to bring their grain from around and turn it into flour. Over there is the well where they used to draw up water. It's since been filled in, covered with ivy and barred up so that no one falls in. Other ruins are scattered around the fields, just home to owls and rats now. You might have heard them in this video, funnily enough. But they are all that is left of the people who lived here, just a shadow of their handiwork. I don't know why they cried or laughed, their crowning achievements. I don't know what meaning they found in this world. Don't they deserve to see what they might have become, what new meaning they might have found? I think my granddad did. I think the 1.3 million people who died from tuberculosis last year did, or the 700,000 people from malaria did. Everyone knows the first line of Dylan Thomas's famous poem, "Do not go gently into that good night," but fewer remember the second and rest. Old age should burn and rave at the close of day. Rage, rage, against the dying of the light. It's both a vindication of this quest and a demand that we make it worth it. We have eradicated suffering after suffering already, and what louder way is there for us to rage than to reject the death written into our genes? I do not mean to say a longer life will not be fraught with its own problems, that there will not be decays we must resist and fight off. Knowing when the age of fire needs to end matters. But shouldn't we get to make that choice? To rage, to keep up that revolt as long as we can, to not let the sun set until we are finished with it, when we have, as Thomas writes, done every good, made every difference. I only rage because I am unfinished with this world, as too many die already unfinished with theirs. The poem ends with a man begging his dying father to fight on. I couldn't help but see my own grandfather's righteous anger in those words. And you, my father, there on a sad height, curse, bless me now with your fierce tears, I pray. Do not go gentle into that good night. Rage, rage, against the dying of the light.
Stand up against the wall so I can trace you with one fine line. We have become a home that's built of all your poems and